The stagecoach rolled into Darrow Flats on a Tuesday in late October, trailing a cloud of red dust and the smell of horse sweat and something close to desperation. It was the kind of afternoon where the sky couldn't decide between blue and gray, and the wind off the mesa came in low and mean, tugging at hat brims and carrying grit into people's eyes. A small crowd had gathered near the post office, not because anyone was expecting mail, but because word had gotten around that Colton Reeves's mail-order bride was arriving on the noon coach, and in a town this size, that was entertainment enough. Colton stood apart from the crowd. One shoulder leaned against the hitching post outside the freight office, hat pulled low. He wasn't watching the coach. He was watching the ground in front of his boots, turning a folded piece of paper over in his hands. The letter she'd sent 3 weeks ago, the last one before she'd boarded the train in Philadelphia. He'd read it enough times to have it memorized, though he'd never admit that to anyone. Her handwriting was careful and even, the kind that came from someone who'd learned to be precise because imprecision cost things. She'd written about the weather in Pennsylvania, about the boarding house she'd stayed in while waiting for the final arrangements, about a stray cat that had kept her company the last 2 nights. She hadn't written about being afraid, but he knew she was. He would have been too. The coach door opened. He looked up. The first person out was an older man in a merchant's coat, then a woman with a child on her hip who immediately started scanning the crowd for someone familiar. Then the driver climbed down from the box and started unhitching luggage, and for a moment Colton thought maybe she hadn't come, that she'd changed her mind at the last stop, or the stop before that, or somewhere back in Albuquerque where a woman with any good sense would have looked at the direction she was heading and turned around. Then she appeared in the doorway of the coach. She had to use both hands on the doorframe to lower herself down to the step, and even that small motion looked like it cost her something. She was a heavy-set woman, soft-faced and pale, wearing a dark blue traveling dress that was wrinkled from days on the road. Her hair was coming loose from its pins on one side. There was a carpet bag clutched to her chest like she was afraid someone might take it. Colton heard the first whisper from behind him before he'd taken 2 steps toward the coach. He didn't turn around to see who it was. She made it to the ground, stood still for a moment with her eyes closed, the way someone does when they're gathering what's left of themselves. When she opened them, she looked directly at him, and whatever she saw must have been readable, because something in her face shifted. Braced, maybe. Ready for the blow. He watched her take 1 step toward him. Then her knees gave. He moved before he'd made a decision to move, crossing the distance between them in a few long strides and catching her before she hit the ground. She was heavier than he'd expected, and he took the full weight of her awkwardly, one arm under her shoulders and the other barely getting under her knees in time, and they both nearly went down together. He got his footing, held her. She was burning up. The heat coming off her skin was immediate and alarming, the kind of fever that didn't come on in a day. "Miss Carter," he said, her eyes opened part way. "Mr. Reeves?" Her voice was barely there. "I'm sorry, I usually don't apologize," he said. He turned toward the wagon he'd brought, and behind him the whispers that had started soft were growing into something less polite. He heard a woman's voice, clear and unhurried, say, "Well, he's certainly gotten himself into something now." He heard laughter that someone had made a half-effort to swallow. He kept walking. Her name was Abigail Carter, and she was 26 years old, and she had come to New Mexico territory with $43, a carpet bag containing everything she owned, and a written agreement that had been arranged through a matrimonial bureau out of Santa Fe. The agreement was simple by design. Colton Reeves, rancher, age 31, owner of the Reeves Cattle Ranch outside Darrow Flats, New Mexico territory, sought a wife with capacity for hard work and household management. In exchange, he offered a home, provision, and the legal protections of marriage. Affection was not mentioned in the agreement. Neither was love. The Bureau had been straightforward about the nature of the arrangement, and Abigail had been straightforward with herself about why she was accepting it. She had nowhere else to go. Her parents had died the previous winter, both of them within 6 weeks of each other. Her father first, from a lung infection that had moved fast, and her mother following in what the doctor called a failure of the heart, but what Abigail had understood as something closer to the failure of a reason to continue. The house had been rented. There were debts. There was a brother in Boston who'd made it clear, with the particular brand of politeness that's worse than rudeness, that he had a family of his own and not much room for complications. She'd spent 4 months looking for work in Philadelphia. She was educated. She'd helped her father run his dry goods account since she was 14, could keep books, could write clear correspondence, understood figures. But the positions that matched those skills wanted men, and the positions that wanted women wanted youth and appearance in a way that was never stated directly but was always understood. She was turned down more times than she counted, and after a while she stopped counting. The matrimonial bureau advertisement had been tucked in the back of a newspaper she'd found on a bench in a park. She almost hadn't read it. She'd read it 4 times. She wrote the letter that same evening. The journey out had taken 11 days by train and 2 more by stagecoach, and somewhere around the second day on the coach, she'd realized that the headache she'd been attributing to exhaustion was something worse. By the time they reached the stop in Bernalillo, she was running a fever. She'd told no one. There was no one to tell and nowhere to stop, and she had not come this far to turn back. So she held on. She held on through 2 more days of coach travel on roads that were more suggestion than fact, through cold nights and hot afternoons, and the constant pitch and jostle of the wheels. She held on right up until the moment she stepped off the coach in Darrow Flats, and her body decided that holding on had used up everything it had. Colton's ranch was 6 miles outside of town, up a road that cut through scrub and red rock, and didn't improve much along the way. He drove the wagon himself, Abigail lying in the bed behind him wrapped in a horse blanket he'd pulled from under the seat. She slipped in and out of awareness. At some point she thought she heard him talking, but when she opened her eyes, he wasn't saying anything, just driving, jaw set, eyes on the road ahead. His housekeeper, a woman named Rosa Delgado who'd been cooking and managing the ranch house for 7 years, came out to the porch when she heard the wagon. She took one look at the situation and started giving orders. She was in her mid-50s, short, and she had the particular authority of someone who understood exactly which things actually mattered and had no patience for anything that didn't. "Bring her inside," she said. "Not the front room. Spare room off the kitchen. It's warmer." "I know where the spare room is, Rosa." "Then stop standing there." They got Abigail into the bed. Rosa sent the ranch hand who'd appeared in the doorway for well water and clean rags and whatever willow bark was left in the kitchen cabinet. Colton stood in the doorway of the spare room and watched Rosa work with the efficient, matter-of-fact care of someone who'd managed worse. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough," Rosa said without looking up. "She's been traveling sick for days by the look of it. Didn't tell anyone, I'd guess." "No." "Stubborn," Rosa said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite disapproval. Colton watched Abigail's face in the thin light from the window. Even sick, even as pale and worn down as she was, there was something in her expression that wasn't defeated. He couldn't have said what it was exactly, a particular set of the jaw, maybe, or the way her hands had closed around the edge of the blanket, even in sleep, like she was prepared to hold on to something. "I'll sit with her tonight," he said. Rosa looked at him then. "I'll sit with her," he said again. Rosa went back to what she was doing. "I'll bring coffee," she said. The fever broke on the 4th day. Abigail came back to herself slowly, the way you do when your body has been somewhere else for a while and hasn't fully decided to return. The first thing she was aware of was the ceiling. Wood planks, close-grained, with a knot in one of them shaped something like a boot. The second thing was the smell of wood smoke and something cooking, something with onions. The third was that there was a man asleep in the chair beside her bed with his chin dropped to his chest and a cold cup of coffee on the floor beside the chair. She lay still and looked at him. He was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. The brief description in the bureau correspondence had said, rancher, practical man, not given to excess in speech or temperament. That had told her almost nothing. In person, in sleep, he looked younger than she'd imagined. The lines in his face were from weather and work rather than age, and there was something almost uncertain about him when he wasn't awake to arrange himself otherwise. She must have moved because he startled up from the chair like someone had called his name. "You're awake," he said. "It would appear so." Her voice came out rough and thin. "How long was I—" 4 days. She absorbed that. "The wagon. You drove me out." "Yes. You didn't have to. You were sick," he said, as though that settled it. She looked at the ceiling again. "I should have told someone on the coach." That I was ill. I didn't want to be. She stopped. Left behind? He said. She didn't answer. He picked up the cold coffee, looked at it, set it back down. Rosa's been cooking. When you're ready to eat something, she'll bring it. Don't try to do too much at once. Mr. Reeves? Colton, he said. Colton. The name felt strange in her mouth. I want to be honest with you about something. I came here under the terms of the arrangement, and I intend to honor those terms. But I'm aware that I may not be what you were. That is, I know I'm not. She stopped again, frustrated with herself. She was usually better with words than this. I'm not what most men have in mind. He was quiet for a moment. What most men have in mind has never impressed me much, he said finally. She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at the knot in the ceiling that looked like a boot and tried to decide if he was being kind or honest or both. Get some rest, he said. There's no urgency about any of it. He stood up, took the cup, and left the room. She heard his boots on the wood floor in the kitchen, and Rosa's voice saying something she couldn't make out, and then the back door opening and closing. She closed her eyes. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without dreaming about anything at all. But the ranch was called the Reeves Place, or sometimes just the Reeves Spread, and it occupied a portion of high mesa land about a mile east of a seasonal creek that ran well in spring and dried to mud by August. It ran somewhere around 300 head of cattle, mostly Herefords with some Longhorn crosses, and it employed 6 permanent hands and more during roundup and branding seasons. The ranch house itself was solid but plain, built for function, with a kitchen large enough to work in, and a front room with a fireplace that did its job, and a covered porch that faced south toward the valley. Abigail learned all of this gradually, in the way you learn a place when you're recovering from an illness and can only move through it a little at a time. Rosa was her primary source of information in those first days. Rosa talked while she worked, which was most of the time, and Abigail listened and filed things away. She learned that the ranch had been Colton's father's before it was Colton's, and that his father had died 3 years ago and left it to him with more debt than anyone had known about. She learned that Colton had spent 2 years stabilizing the operation and was still not entirely out from under the inherited obligations. She learned that the previous year's cattle prices had been poor, and this year were not much better. She learned that there had been 2 other women before Abigail, both answers to matrimonial advertisements, both of whom had arrived, looked at what they were getting into, and gone back east on the next available transportation. He doesn't talk about them, Rosa said, not pausing in her bread making. But I was here both times. First one lasted 9 days. Second one lasted 3. Why? Abigail asked. Rosa shrugged. Life out here is hard. Not everyone has the stomach for it. Abigail looked out the kitchen window at the yard where one of the ranch hands was repairing a section of fence with the resigned efficiency of someone doing a job that would need doing again in 6 months. The wind was moving through the scrub on the far side of the yard, bending it all in the same direction. What do you think of it? She asked. Living here. Rosa was quiet for a moment. It's where I am, she said finally. Been where I am for a long time. You stop thinking about whether you think of it, and you just live it. Abigail didn't say anything to that, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. Well, by the end of the second week, she was well enough to move through the house without resting between rooms. By the start of the third, she was helping Rosa in the kitchen in the mornings, not because anyone asked her to, but because she needed to be doing something, or she would begin to think too much about everything she didn't know yet. It was in the kitchen, on a Thursday morning, that she first heard what people were saying. She hadn't been meant to hear it. One of the younger hands, a boy of maybe 18 named Pete, had come to the back door for something, and he'd brought with him another boy she didn't recognize, someone from town maybe, or from one of the neighboring operations. They were talking on the other side of the door while Pete knocked, and they didn't know she was standing close enough to hear. Saw her in the window when I rode past, the unfamiliar one was saying. Big as a barn. Pete said something too low to hear. I'm just saying what everyone's saying. Colton could have done better. Man his age, his property, he could have had his pick. She's not bad looking, though, Pete said. In the face, I mean. She'll never last. Work out here will break her in a month. Soft woman like that. A pause. Word in town is she's not even healthy. Showed up half dead. Probably won't make it to spring. The knock came then, and Abigail opened the door. Pete looked at her with the expression of someone who has just realized a conversation has been overheard and cannot calculate how much. The other boy looked at the ground. "Morning," she said pleasantly and without any change in her voice. "What do you need?" Pete told her. She got it. She handed it over. She closed the door. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time after, looking out at the yard, at the fence, at the mesa beyond the fence with its flat top and red sides. Soft woman like that. Won't last. Won't make it to spring. She didn't cry. She was past crying about that kind of thing. Or maybe she'd just used up whatever reservoir she'd had for it somewhere back in Philadelphia when the fourth employer in a row had looked at her across a desk and seen someone who didn't fit what they were looking for. What she felt instead was something quieter and more deliberate than anger. Something that needed somewhere to go. She wiped her hands on the dish towel. She walked to the front room where Colton kept the ranch's financial records in a wooden crate under the window. She'd noticed them on her second day. A dozen leather-bound ledger books and a mess of loose correspondence. She'd been curious about them since then, in the way she was always curious about numbers, the way other people might be curious about a locked door. She pulled the crate out. She sat down on the floor. The chair was on the other side of the room and she didn't feel like moving it. And she opened the first ledger. The numbers inside were a disaster, not a catastrophic disaster, not the kind that meant everything was lost, but the kind that came from someone who was skilled at ranching and genuinely poor at keeping records. Entries in no consistent order, some months recorded in detail, and others in a single line, costs and income mixed together without separation. Two different systems seemed to have been running simultaneously at some point, and then abandoned. The most recent ledger had 6 weeks of entries and then nothing. She sat on the floor for 2 hours with the books spread around her and worked out what she was actually looking at. When Colton came in from the morning's work, she was still there. He stopped in the doorway, looked at her on the floor surrounded by his financial records. His expression moved through something she couldn't fully read. "What are you doing?" he said. "I'm reorganizing your books." She looked up. "Your expense tracking is spread across 3 ledgers with no consistent method. You're probably overpaying on supply orders because you don't have a clear record of what you've spent at each vendor. And someone recorded May's cattle sale income in what appears to be February's column, which means your profit calculation for the first half of the year is wrong by somewhere around—" She checked the number she'd written on a scrap of paper. $83. He stared at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have asked first. I can put them back." "You can read those?" "I can do more than read them." She picked up the most recent ledger and turned it toward him. "You have a feed supplier in Las Cruces. You're paying 15 cents a unit more than the standard rate. Have you ever renegotiated the contract?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father set that contract." "I know. I found the original agreement in the back of the crate." She paused. "Contracts can be renegotiated." Colton looked at her for a long time. Then he walked across the room, and instead of taking the ledger from her, he sat down on the floor across from her, which surprised her, because she hadn't expected that, and he looked at the numbers she'd written. $83, he said. "Approximately. I'd need to run the full calculation to give you an exact figure." He leaned back against the base of the chair he hadn't moved to sit in. "Where'd you learn all this?" "My father's dry goods business," she said. "I kept his accounts from the time I was 14. "How long did you do it?" 12 years. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I want to be useful," she said. It came out more plainly than she'd intended. "I'm not going to be able to do the physical work that—" She stopped. Started again. "I know what I look like. I know what people say. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I can do this, and I can do it well." He was looking at the numbers again, not at her. "Rosa said you helped with the bread this morning." "I did. How's your appetite coming back?" "Better," she said. He nodded. He reached out and turned one of the other ledgers toward himself, frowning at the columns. "Can you fix the February problem?" "Yes," she said. "Can you figure out if there are other ones like it?" "Yes." He looked up then, and his eyes were direct and level, and she couldn't tell if he'd made a decision or was in the process of making one. "All right," he said. "Then fix them." He got up off the floor, which he did with the ease of someone accustomed to getting up off ground that wasn't always flat, and he picked up his hat from the table and walked back out. Abigail sat for a moment in the quiet he'd left behind. Then she pulled the next ledger toward her and kept working. She had been on the ranch for 3 weeks when the first of the ranch hands spoke to her directly. His name was Harlan Dupree, and he was the oldest of the permanent crew, somewhere in his late 40s, she estimated, with the kind of face that had given up being surprised by things some years ago. He found her one afternoon in the barn while she was inventorying the supply cabinet that hung on the north wall, a job Rosa had mentioned nobody had done in 2 years. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, "but no one else has, and it needs doing." He watched her for a moment. "You're writing it all down?" "If I don't write it down, I'll forget what I counted," she said, "and then it won't have been worth doing." He was quiet for a while. She kept working. "Pete feels bad," he said eventually. She paused. "About what?" He looked at her in a way that said he knew she knew exactly what. "About what he said. At the back door." She kept her voice even. "I don't need him to feel bad. I need him to do his work." Harlan was quiet again. Then he said, "What do you need counted that you can't reach?" She looked up at him. He wasn't offering out of pity. She could tell the difference. He was offering because the job needed doing, and she had a list and he had height. "Top shelf," she said. "There are tins of axle grease up there I can't see clearly." He reached up without ceremony and counted them off while she wrote. They worked through the rest of the inventory without talking much, which suited her fine. By the time they finished, the sun was getting low, and the barn was going gold at the edges. "You're not what I figured," Harlan said when they were done. She closed the notebook. "What did you figure?" He shrugged. "Someone who'd be gone by now." She looked at him. He looked back. There was no cruelty in it, just the flat honesty of someone stating a fact. "I'm not gone," she said. "No," he said. "You're not." He took his hat from a nail on the post and put it on and went back out into the evening. Abigail stood in the barn with her notebook and the smell of hay and horses around her, and she let out a breath that felt like it had been stored up for longer than just the afternoon. She had nowhere to go. That was still true, but she was beginning to think that maybe here, in this particular nowhere, she might actually be able to build something. Not the life she'd imagined when she was young and had the kind of expectations that circumstances hadn't finished revising yet. Something different. Something that fitted the actual shape of who she was, rather than who she was supposed to be. She walked back to the house in the blue evening light. Through the kitchen window, she could see Rosa moving around the stove, the lamp already lit against the coming dark. In the front room, she could see Colton at the table with the reorganized ledger open in front of him, running a finger down a column she'd spent an afternoon correcting. She went in through the back door. "Supper in 20 minutes, Rosa said. "I'll set the table," Abigail said. She got the plates down from the shelf and set them out, 1, 2, 3. And for a moment, the weight of each one in her hands felt like something solid and real in a way that very little had felt for a long time. She set the table. Supper came. Outside, the wind moved off the mesa in the dark, and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds, and Abigail Carter sat down to eat at a table that was not yet hers, but was beginning, slowly, to feel less foreign. The table became hers by degrees. That was how most things happened on the ranch. Not in a single moment, not with any announcement, but through accumulation. A small claim here, a small claim there, until one day you looked up and realized the territory had shifted without anyone formally declaring it. The morning after she'd set supper out for the first time, Abigail came into the kitchen before Rosa and found the lamp unlit and the stove cold, and a particular silence in the room that told her she was the first one up. She stood in the dark for a moment, hand on the doorframe, wondering if she was overstepping. Then she decided she wasn't going to wonder about that every time, because if she did, she'd spend the next year frozen in doorways. She lit the lamp. She got the stove going. She found the coffee and the pot and made a reasonable attempt at the proportions Rosa used, though she'd gotten them wrong by the time Colton came in from checking the overnight pasture situation, because he drank the first cup without his usual grimace, and she suspected Rosa's coffee was stronger. "Morning," he said, setting his hat on the hook. "Morning," she said. "I think I got the coffee wrong. Too weak." He looked into his cup. "It's fine. You don't have to say that. I'm not just saying it." He poured a second cup and sat down at the table. Rosa usually makes it strong enough to stand a spoon in. This is different, not wrong. Abigail turned back to the stove. A week ago, she would have apologized again anyway. She didn't this time. They ate breakfast in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable so much as careful. Two people still learning the shape of each other, still figuring out where to put their words and where to leave space. After, Colton went out to the morning's work, and Abigail went back to the ledgers, and the day organized itself around those two separate purposes the way the days had started to do. It was a rhythm. Not yet a life, but something that life could be built on. Boss. What she didn't know in those first weeks when she was still getting her strength back and learning the ranch by its sounds and its smells, and the way the light changed on the mesa at different hours, was how closely Colton had stayed near her during the worst of the fever. Rosa told her. Not directly. Rosa rarely said things directly when she could allow them to arrive sideways, but over 3 or 4 different conversations, it accumulated into a picture. He was in that chair most of the first 2 nights, Rosa said one morning, not looking up from the pot she was scrubbing. I tried to send him to bed. He told me he'd sleep in the chair if he was going to sleep at all. Abigail kept her eyes on the bread she was working. Why? Because you were sick, Rosa said, in a tone that suggested the question was strange. He didn't know me. No, Rosa agreed, but you were in his house and you were sick, and he's the kind of man who stays. Abigail thought about that for a long time. She thought about what kind of man stayed when he didn't have to. She thought about all the people she'd known in her life who hadn't, and how she'd slowly revised her expectations downward until she wasn't expecting much at all. He missed 2 mornings of work, Rosa added. Harlan had to manage the crew. Colton doesn't miss mornings unless something important is keeping him. She said it and then went back to scrubbing the pot, and Abigail kept working the bread, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the information sat in her like something warm, and she didn't try to talk herself out of it the way she might have before. Her strength came back unevenly, the way it always does after a real illness. A good day followed by a day where everything cost twice what it should, and then 2 better days, and then a morning where she woke up tired for no particular reason. She didn't push past it the way she might have if she'd been alone somewhere. The ranch, for all its hardness, had the particular quality of a place with a lot to do, and a lot to do meant she could set her own pace without anyone noticing. By the 5th week, she was doing half the ranch accounts with consistency. She'd worked out a new system. Not complicated, just organized, with expense categories that stayed in the same columns every month and a running total that cleared the confusion between what was owed and what had been paid. She'd shown it to Colton one evening, walking him through the logic of it, half expecting resistance. He'd asked 3 questions, all of them practical, all of them good, and then he'd said, "All right, let's do it this way." And that had been that. What she hadn't expected was that the ranch hands would notice. It started with small things. Harlan started bringing her the receipts from town supply runs without being asked, folding them precisely and handing them over when he came in, the way you hand something to someone who you know is going to need it. Pete, who still looked at her sideways sometimes with the residue of guilt he hadn't fully worked out what to do with, started writing down the gate counts when he rotated the cattle, leaving the numbers on the kitchen table with his name at the bottom of the paper. A man named Gus, who was quiet in general and particularly quiet around her, once left a note on the supply cabinet saying that the axle grease count she'd recorded was off by 2 tins because he'd used them on Thursday and forgotten to say so. It was not admiration. It was something more practical than admiration and more lasting. It was the beginning of being treated like someone whose work mattered to the operation. She was careful not to make too much of it, but she also stopped pretending it wasn't happening. The conversation she kept turning over in her mind, though, the one she couldn't quite put down, had happened on a Sunday in her 5th week, when she'd walked out to the porch in the late afternoon because the kitchen had gotten too warm and she'd needed air. Colton was already out there, sitting on the top step with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, looking out at the valley. She almost went back inside. Then she decided not to and sat down on the other end of the step, and they both looked at the valley for a while. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why the advertisement?" She paused. "The matrimonial bureau. You could have... There must be women locally who..." "There aren't many," he said. "Not unattached ones." "Still." You could have waited. He was quiet for a bit. I'm 31, he said. The ranch is where I want it to be, or close enough. I needed someone who wanted a specific kind of life, not someone I had to convince. He turned the cup in his hands. The women around here, the ones I might have courted, they know what this life is. Most of them have already decided it's not for them, and I didn't want to spend 2 years finding that out the slow way. And you thought someone from back east wouldn't know what they were getting into, she said. He glanced at her. I thought someone from back east might want it enough to learn. She considered that. That's a generous interpretation. It's the one I decided on. He set the cup down on the step. What about you? Why here specifically? There must have been other advertisements. There were, she said. Why this one? She looked at the valley for a moment. The light was doing something complicated with the clouds over the mesa, going orange and purple in layers. Your advertisement said capacity for hard work and household management, she said. Most of the others said things like pleasant disposition and agreeable nature and good health. Yours was the only one that was interested in what a person could actually do. He didn't say anything. I can do things, she said. Not defensively, just plainly. I wanted somewhere that would let me. She could feel him looking at the side of her face, but she kept her eyes on the valley. Well, he said after a moment, you've found it. The sun kept going down. Neither of them went inside right away. The problem arrived on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after Abigail had come to the ranch, in the form of a man named Douglas Fitch. Fitch ran a supply and credit operation out of Darrow Flats, the kind of business that positioned itself as essential and then made itself expensive. He'd been extending credit to the ranch for 2 years, ever since Colton had inherited the debt situation and needed bridging funds between cattle sales. The terms of the credit arrangement were recorded in one of the ledgers Abigail had reorganized, and when she'd found them, she'd read them twice and then sat very still for a few minutes. The interest rate was not illegal, but it was close to the upper edge of what was legal, and the repayment structure was designed in a way that made it very difficult to get out from under the principal. There was a clause buried in the third paragraph of the agreement that allowed Fitch to call the full balance due within 30 days if he judged the ranch's operating capacity to have materially declined, a phrase that was defined nowhere in the document. She'd flagged it for Colton. He'd read it. He'd said something quiet and not particularly polite under his breath, and then asked her if she was sure about the interpretation. She was sure. He's been doing business with my family since before I was born, Colton said. That doesn't make the clause any less real, she said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. What Fitch wanted, when he arrived that Wednesday in his good coat with his careful manner and his smile that didn't connect to anything above his cheekbones, became clear within 10 minutes. He had a new agreement he wanted Colton to sign, an extension of the credit arrangement with a restructured payment schedule. He presented it at the kitchen table, smoothing it flat with his palm, and started explaining it with the particular fluency of someone who'd given this explanation many times and knew how to keep moving so you didn't have time to look too closely at what you were hearing. Abigail was in the room. She'd been at the counter when Fitch arrived, working on the supply inventory, and nobody had suggested she leave, so she stayed. She read the new agreement over Colton's shoulder while Fitch talked. The interest rate was higher than the existing one. The material decline clause was still there, with the same vague language. There was a new paragraph near the end that gave Fitch the right to inspect the ranch's livestock records on 30 days' notice, which sounded reasonable until you understood that a man with that right and that material decline clause had a great deal of leverage over the operation. Mr. Fitch, she said. Fitch looked at her. He'd acknowledged her presence when he arrived with a nod that managed to be both polite and dismissive simultaneously. The new rate, she said. You've moved it up 2 points from the existing agreement. That reflects current market conditions, Fitch said pleasantly. Lending rates across the territory have adjusted. Have they? She said. I'd be interested to see documentation of that. A small silence. I don't generally bring... I understand, she said. I'm just noting that without documentation, it's difficult to verify whether the adjustment is market-driven or specific to this arrangement. She looked at the paper. Also, paragraph 7 gives you inspection rights over livestock records. That combined with the material decline clause in paragraph 4 creates a situation where you could theoretically... Abigail. Colton's voice was quiet. She stopped. Fitch looked at Colton with an expression that was difficult to read precisely, but carried something in it that wasn't entirely friendly. I wasn't aware you're... He paused on whatever word he'd been going to use and picked a different one. Your associate had a role in the business arrangements. She keeps my accounts, Colton said. Another silence. Fitch looked back at the agreement, then at Colton, and the smile reappeared. Of course. Take your time reviewing it. I don't need an answer today. He folded the agreement, left it on the table, and said his goodbyes pleasantly enough. When the sound of his horse had faded from the yard, the kitchen was very quiet. Colton sat looking at the folded paper for a moment. Then he looked at her. Paragraph 7, he said. And paragraph 4, she said. Together they give him the right to decide, essentially unilaterally, when you're in enough trouble that he can call the full balance. And with inspection rights over your records, he'd have early warning of any bad season, which would let him call the note before I'd had a chance to recover. Yes. Colton leaned back in the chair. He was quiet for a while in the particular way he got when he was working something out and didn't want to talk until he'd finished. Abigail waited. She'd learned already that his silences were productive ones. What would you do? He said. About the agreement? Yes. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I wouldn't sign it. I'd go back to the existing terms and make the payments on schedule for 6 months and then renegotiate from a position where the balance is lower. She paused. And I'd find out what the current lending rates actually are. If he's misrepresenting market conditions, that matters. Where would I find that out? There's a territorial bank in Las Cruces. They'd have published rates. She hesitated. I could write to them, if you want. He looked at her with that direct measuring look she was starting to understand as the way he looked at things he was deciding about. Yes, he said. Write to them. She picked up the folded agreement and went back to the counter. She didn't say anything else about it, and neither did he, and she spent the rest of the afternoon working through the supply inventory with a particular focus that was partly the job and partly the residue of the encounter with Fitch, which had left something in her that felt like the opposite of being dismissed. She'd spoken in that room. She'd been heard. It was a small thing, but small things were how the territory shifted. The letter to the Las Cruces bank went out the next morning. The answer came back inside 2 weeks because Abigail had been specific enough in her questions that the bank officer had bothered to be specific in return. She read the response at the kitchen table with Rosa looking over her shoulder and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. The current lending rates in the territory, as published by the Territorial Banking Authority, were between 6 and 8% for secured agricultural loans. Fitch's existing agreement was at 11. The new agreement he'd proposed was at 13. She brought it to Colton that evening. He read the bank's letter. He read it again. He set it down on the table and didn't say anything for a full minute, which she was now experienced enough to know meant something real was happening underneath. He's been doing this for years, Colton said finally. With other ranches, too, probably. Probably, she agreed. My father signed that original agreement without... He stopped. My father trusted him. Your father may not have had access to the rate information, she said carefully. It's not widely published. You'd have to specifically write and ask. He looked at her. How did you know to ask? She thought about it. Because when something's presented as standard, the first question is, standard compared to what? She paused. My father's suppliers used to do something similar. Slightly different amounts, framing it as industry normal. He lost 3 years of margin before we worked it out. Colton was quiet again. Then, I'm not going to sign Fitch's new agreement. I know, and I'm going to renegotiate the existing one. That'll be harder, she said. He'll resist. Yes. His jaw set in the way it did when he'd decided something and wasn't interested in being talked out of it. But I'm going to do it, and I'm going to want you in that meeting. She didn't let herself look startled. All right, she said. He doesn't expect it, Colton said. He looked at you in this kitchen and decided you were someone he didn't need to account for. He picked up the bank's letter. He's wrong about that. She said nothing, but she took her tea to the window and looked out at the yard in the evening light and permitted herself, quietly and without drama, to feel something close to a kind of satisfaction she hadn't had access to for a very long time. The meeting with Fitch happened on a Friday morning in his office on Main Street in Darrow Flats. and the town was in its usual Friday state of partial activity. Wagons in the street, the sound of the blacksmith 2 buildings down, a group of men outside the dry goods store doing nothing in particular with great commitment. Abigail had been into Darrow Flats once since her arrival, briefly, to collect a package at the post office, and she'd been aware of eyes following her in the way she was always aware of eyes following her in places she was new to. This time she walked next to Colton along the main street, and she kept her pace steady and her posture what it was, and she didn't look at the eyes or the expressions attached to them, though she catalogued them in her peripheral vision the way she'd always catalogued things, automatically, without meaning to, because her mind sorted information whether she asked it to or not. Fitch's office was neat in the way that said money spent on appearances rather than function. A large desk, 2 good chairs opposite it, a landscape painting on the wall behind that had nothing to do with New Mexico. Fitch himself stood up when they came in, and the surprise at seeing Abigail was visible for half a second before he covered it. "Colton," he said, and "Miss Carter manages my accounts," Colton said. "She'll be in this meeting." Fitch's mouth moved briefly through something before settling back on pleasant. "Of course." They sat. Colton started the conversation in the direct way he had. No preliminary softening, just the fact of it. He was declining to sign the new agreement and wanted to renegotiate the terms of the existing one. Fitch listened with the patience of a man who'd had this kind of meeting before and knew how to wait it out. When Colton finished, Fitch leaned back, nodded slowly, said the existing terms were fair and market appropriate, and that he didn't see room for the Territorial Bank in Las Cruces publishes lending rates, Abigail said. We have their most recent communication. The market rate for a secured agricultural loan in this territory is between 6 and 8%. A pause. Our arrangement is at 11, she said. The agreement you proposed last week was at 13. That's not a market adjustment. That's a significant premium above market in both cases. Fitch looked at her with an expression that had moved past pleasant into something more careful. The bank's published rates apply to secured agricultural loans, she said. This ranch has 300 head of Hereford crosses, 6 full-time hands, and clear title to the property. It qualifies as secured agricultural. She opened the folder she'd brought, which contained the bank's letter and her own summary of the existing agreement terms side by side. I've also noted the material decline clause in the existing agreement. We'd like that removed as part of the renegotiation. Fitch looked at Colton. This is quite a list of demands. It's quite a list of facts, Colton said. He sounded calm, which Abigail knew by now was not the same as relaxed. I'd like to work out an arrangement that's fair to both sides. Miss Carter can walk through the numbers if that's useful. Another pause. Fitch looked at the folder in Abigail's hands, then back at Colton, and she could see him recalibrating, working out that this was not the meeting he'd walked in expecting. The negotiation took an hour and 20 minutes. It wasn't clean. Fitch pushed back on 3 different points and gave ground on them all eventually, but not easily. By the time they walked out with a written commitment to renegotiate at 9% with the material decline clause removed pending formal documentation, Abigail's hands were slightly unsteady, and she'd been holding her posture straight for so long that her back ached between the shoulder blades. On the street outside, in the mid-morning light, Colton stopped walking for a moment. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. It's been a while since I did something like that. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face that she didn't try to interpret right away, because she was still managing the residue of the meeting and didn't trust her reading of things. You were right, he said. About all of it. I know, she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Most people don't say that. Most people spend energy being modest about things they actually know, she said. It's not a habit I've found useful. He started walking again. She walked beside him. On the street, a woman she didn't know looked at them from the doorway of the milliner's shop, looked at her specifically, the way people did, with a particular quality of appraisal she'd long since learned to recognize. And Abigail met her eyes briefly and kept walking. She was not a guest here, not a temporary arrangement, not a woman marking time until something better arrived. She kept walking. The street was dusty, and the sun was high, and she was tired in the specific way that came from doing something hard and doing it well. And it was, she realized somewhere between the milliner's shop and the end of the block, one of the better feelings she'd had in a long time. Tasam. What changed after the Fitch meeting was subtle at first. Harlan mentioned it to the other hands, she suspected, because there was a slight shift in how they looked at her. Nothing dramatic, nothing that announced itself, just a small adjustment in the quality of attention, the difference between someone being acknowledged and someone being seen. Pete stopped looking guilty and started looking something closer to respectful, which was an improvement in both his mood and hers. Rosa, who'd heard the account of the meeting from Abigail over supper preparations and had listened without comment until the end, said, "Fitch has been doing that to ranches around here for 15 years, and then went back to the stew, and the way she said it told Abigail that the information was not incidental. Colton worked. He always worked, from before full light to after dark most days, the way ranching required, with the particular focused energy of someone who understood that the work didn't stop because you were tired. But he started appearing in the kitchen at odd intervals, mid-morning sometimes, or in the late afternoon before supper, ostensibly for coffee or to check something in the accounts. And she noticed that those intervals had grown more frequent over the past few weeks. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. One evening, later than usual, she was finishing the week's ledger summary at the kitchen table when he came in from the last round of the property. He poured himself the last of the coffee, leaned against the counter, and looked at what she was doing. "Still at it," he said. "Almost done." She finished the column, checked the total, entered it. "There." She closed the ledger and looked up at him. He was looking at her in the way he sometimes had. Not the measuring look, something different, something she'd noticed more recently and hadn't assigned a word to yet. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. Before you came, I thought this was going to be a practical arrangement." He said it without apology, but also without comfort, just putting the words out plainly. "I thought it would work or it wouldn't, and there wasn't much more to it than that." "That's what I thought too," she said. "Yes." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'm not sure I still think that." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the ranch was in the particular stillness it found late at night when the work was done. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the closed ledger on the table. "I'm not sure either," she said. Not a declaration, not a beginning of something announced, just the truth, set quietly in the room between them, which was its own kind of beginning. He finished the coffee. He said goodnight. He went to bed. She sat at the table for a while after, with the lamp burning low, and she didn't think about what had been said so much as she let it settle into the room around her. Settle into the kitchen that was becoming hers, in the house that was becoming something, in the life she was building out of the ruin of what she'd had before. Not smooth, not clean, nothing like the life she'd been told to want when she was young enough to believe in what she was told, but real, solid, hers in the way only things you've built yourself can be. She put out the lamp and went to bed, and outside the mesa held its dark shape against the stars, and the ranch went on in its nighttime quiet, and Abigail Carter slept with the particular heaviness of someone who has, against considerable odds, found somewhere to land. The renegotiated agreement with Fitch came through in writing 3 weeks later, and Abigail filed it in a new folder she'd made specifically for contracts and formal correspondence, which she kept in the wooden crate alongside the ledgers, but separated from them by a piece of stiff board she'd cut from the back of an old calendar. It was a small thing, that folder. But it was the kind of small thing that meant someone intended to stay. The news of what had happened in Fitch's office moved through Darrow Flats the way news always moved through small towns. Not all at once, not through any single telling, but by accumulation, one person mentioning it to another until the shape of the story had traveled far enough that it had begun to change in the retelling. By the version Harlan heard at the feed store 2 weeks after the meeting, Abigail had apparently produced a document from the territorial governor's office. By the version Rosa heard from the woman who delivered eggs on Thursdays, Fitch had practically begged. Neither version was accurate, but neither was entirely wrong in spirit, and Abigail had lived long enough to understand that the spirit of a story was sometimes more durable than the facts of it. What she hadn't anticipated was the invitation. It came via a note delivered to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, handwritten on good stationery in a precise, controlled script. It was from a woman named Eleanor Aldridge, wife of Warren Aldridge, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county, 3 times the size of the Reeves Ranch, with holdings that extended into 2 neighboring territories. The note invited Colton and his associate to a dinner at the Aldridge house the following Saturday evening, along with several other ranching families of the area. Colton read it at the kitchen table and set it down without comment. "Do you want to go?" Abigail asked. "Warren Aldridge doesn't invite people to dinner for social reasons," Colton said. "He invites them because he wants something or because he wants to look at something." "Which is it this time?" Colton looked at the note again. "Probably both." She picked it up and read it herself. The phrasing was careful, associate rather than anything more specific, which told her that Eleanor Aldridge either didn't know the nature of the arrangement or had decided to sidestep it deliberately. "Will it hurt you to go?" "Depends on what he wants." "Will it hurt you to not go?" A pause. "Also depends." She set the note down. "Then we should go," she said. "At least then you know." He looked at her across the table with the expression she'd come to associate with him revising an assumption. "You want to go." "I want to know what Warren Aldridge wants with the Reeves Ranch," she said, "and I want to see the inside of an operation 3 times our size." She paused. "And yes, I want to go." He almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that she could see the direction it was heading. "All right," he said. "We'll go." She had one good dress suitable for dinner, a dark green wool she'd brought from Philadelphia that had survived the journey in better condition than most of her things, packed as it was at the center of the carpet bag with everything else wrapped around it. Rosa looked at it when Abigail laid it out on Saturday afternoon, turned it over in her hands, and said it needed pressing and a small repair at the left cuff, and then she did both without being asked, which was the Rosa Delgado version of a compliment. The Aldridge house was 4 miles north of town, up a road that was noticeably better maintained than most roads in the territory, which Abigail noted and filed away as information about the man who used it. The house itself was large by any standard and enormous by the standards of the region. 2 stories, white painted, with a porch that wrapped 3 sides and windows that were actually level, which meant someone had paid for skilled carpentry rather than making do. There were lights in all the downstairs windows when Colton's wagon came up the drive, and through the front window she could see the shapes of people already inside. He helped her down from the wagon seat, which he'd started doing without ceremony, and she took his arm for the walk to the door, which she'd started doing without thinking about it. The line between arrangement and something else had been blurring for weeks, and neither of them had said anything about it directly, and she wasn't sure yet whether that was avoidance or just the natural pace of 2 careful people. Eleanor Aldridge opened the door herself, which Abigail hadn't expected. She was a tall woman in her mid-50s, with the kind of posture that came from decades of being the person everyone in the room was watching, and eyes that were doing a great deal of assessment behind a very polished social manner. "Colton," she said warmly. Then she looked at Abigail, and the warmth recalibrated slightly. Not removed exactly, but adjusted. "And you must be Miss Carter. I've heard a great deal about you." "I hope some of it was accurate," Abigail said. Eleanor's eyes sharpened briefly with something that might have been surprise or might have been appreciation, and then she smiled at a real one this time, not the social version, and said, "Come in out of the cold." The dining room held 8 people around a table that could have seated 12. Warren Aldridge was at the head, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with the kind of authority that came from never having been seriously told no, and the particular quality of attention that men like that brought to anything new in their environment. He shook Colton's hand and nodded at Abigail with a cordiality that was genuine but measured. The other guests were 2 other ranching couples, the Beaumont family, who ran a mid-sized spread north of the Reeves property, and the Garcias, who had grazing rights on the East Mesa, and a man introduced only as Hargrove, who was a cattle buyer out of Albuquerque, and who looked at everything in the room with the faint air of someone calculating what it was worth. Dinner was elk roast and root vegetables, well prepared, and the first 30 minutes of conversation was the kind that happened in these rooms everywhere. Cattle prices, weather patterns, the state of the Las Cruces Road, a brief complaint about the territorial water rights legislation that everyone seemed to have a position on. Abigail ate and listened and said little and was aware of being watched, which she had always been in rooms like this, but which had a different quality here than it had had in Philadelphia. There, she'd been watched as a social problem. Here, she was being watched as an unknown quantity that people hadn't finished evaluating yet. She preferred unknown quantity. It was when the elk roast had been cleared and a decent apple pie had appeared that Warren Aldridge turned the conversation toward its actual purpose. "There's a buyer coming down from Denver in 6 weeks," he said, addressing the table in general but looking at Colton. "Name's Rutherford. He's representing a Chicago meatpacking consortium that's looking to establish long-term supply contracts with operations in this territory. Could be significant volume. I'm putting together a group of ranches to present a combined offering. Gives us more weight at the table than any one of us alone." Colton nodded slowly. "What kind of terms?" "That's what needs working out," Aldridge said. "Rutherford's done this before, in Colorado and Kansas. He comes in with a standard contract and expects it to be accepted without much modification. I'd like to have someone in the room who's done enough homework to push back intelligently." "What's wrong with his standard contract?" Abigail asked. The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when someone unexpected speaks. Aldridge looked at her, and there was a fraction of a second where she could see him deciding how to receive the question. "We don't know yet," he said. "We haven't seen it. If it follows the pattern of the Colorado and Kansas agreements, the price per head will be fixed for the first year and indexed to a Chicago market rate in subsequent years," she said. "The problem with that structure is that Chicago prices respond to national supply, not territorial supply, so a glut in Texas or Kansas drives down what you're paid, regardless of your own production costs." She paused. "I'd want a floor price guarantee written into any multi-year agreement, and I'd want to know what the penalty clause looks like for non-delivery. Those are often where the real cost lives." Silence. Then Aldridge leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that had shifted substantially from measured cordiality. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "I've been reading the accounts of similar arrangements in the territorial agricultural reports," she said. "The Las Cruces Bank sends them. They don't advertise it, but if you write and ask, they'll put you on the list." Hargrove, the cattle buyer, was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully parse, somewhere between impressed and wary. "You've been reviewing territorial agricultural reports," he said. "Since November," she said. Another silence. "Colton," Aldridge said. He was still looking at Abigail. "I think I've been inviting the wrong person to these meetings." Beside her, she felt Colton shift very slightly, and when she glanced at him, she could see that the expression he was wearing was the one he wore when he was pleased about something and wasn't going to say so directly. The drive home was cold and clear, the stars enormous in the way they got out here when there were no clouds and no town lights to compete. Abigail sat close to Colton on the wagon seat because the temperature had dropped, and there was no practical reason to maintain distance. "Aldridge wants you in the room when Rutherford comes," Colton said. "I know." "He was going to ask on the way out. I could see him working up to it." "He can ask through you," she said. "If I go as part of the Reeves operation." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't want to be borrowed." "I don't want to be borrowed," she agreed. He looked at the road ahead. The horses knew the way home and kept their pace steady without much guidance. "All right," he said. She looked at the stars for a while. "Eleanor Aldridge asked me about the ledgers," she said, "over dessert, while you and Warren were talking. She wanted to know how I'd learned the account system I described." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. My father's business. 12 years. She paused. "She said her husband has been using the same bookkeeper for 15 years and she's never understood what the man actually does." "What did you say?" "I offered to explain it to her if she wanted." She paused again. "She wants to, next Thursday." Colton looked at her. In the dark, she could see the angle of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. "You're going to teach Eleanor Aldridge accounting. I'm going to explain some basic principles. Whether she learns anything is up to her." He turned back to the road. A long pause. "When we get back," he said, "there's something I want to say." She waited. He didn't say anything else until they were at the ranch, until the horses were unhitched and in the barn and the wagon put away. And then they stood in the yard in the cold, clear night, and she waited again because she understood by now that he needed to arrive at things at his own speed. "I want to talk about the arrangement," he said. "All right. The written one, the bureau agreement." She looked at him carefully. "What about it?" He reached into his coat and brought out a folded piece of paper. She recognized it. It was the original document from the matrimonial bureau, the one that had established the terms of their arrangement. He'd kept it in the top drawer of the desk in the front room. He unfolded it. He tore it in half cleanly, and then in half again, and then he put the pieces in his coat pocket. She stood very still. "I don't want an arrangement," he said. His voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't quite as steady. "I want to court you, properly. Not because a document says I agreed to, because—" He stopped. Tried again. "You're the most capable person I've ever met, and I've been arguing with myself about this for 6 weeks, and I'm tired of arguing with myself." She was quiet for a moment. The cold was sharp around them, and the stars were very bright, and the ranch was still. "You tore up the document," she said. "Yes. That means I'm under no legal obligation to stay. I know. You're asking me to stay without the document?" "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she could see that he was genuinely uncertain, not about what he wanted, but about what she might say. He'd taken the armor of the arrangement off and stood there without it, which was not nothing for a man who'd built his life around being prepared. "Ask me properly, then," she said. Something moved through his expression. "Abigail Carter," he said, "will you let me court you? Not as a transaction, as a—" He stopped again, and there was the beginning of something almost rueful in his face. "I'm better with cattle than speeches." "I know," she said. "Ask anyway." "Will you let me court you?" he said. "As a man who has come to regard you as someone he—" A breath. "As someone he's fallen for. Considerably." She stood there in the cold night in her good green dress, with her heart doing something irregular and inconvenient, and she thought about Philadelphia and the bench in the park and the advertisement folded in the newspaper, and she thought about the stagecoach and the fever and the floor of the front room with the ledgers spread around her, and she thought about Fitch's office and Eleanor Aldridge's dinner table and the stars over the mesa and the way he'd sat down on the floor across from her that first afternoon because that was where she was. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. It had been held longer than he'd probably realized. "I should tell you," she said, "that I've been falling for you too. For some weeks. I've been finding it inconvenient." The thing that happened to his face then was not quite a smile and not quite relief and not quite something else she didn't have a word for. It was all three at once, and it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "Good," he said. "That makes 2 of us." They went inside. The thing about a small town was that it knew things before you told it. By the following Tuesday, it was commonly understood in Darrow Flats that something had shifted in the situation at the Reeves Ranch, though nobody could have said exactly how they knew this. Abigail and Colton had not announced anything. They had not behaved differently in public in any dramatic sense. But there was something in how they moved together when they came into town, something in how he deferred to her in conversations, and how she spoke about the ranch with the ease of someone who wasn't temporary, that told people what they needed to know without any formal declaration. Not everyone received the information generously. There was a woman in Darrow Flats named Cecilia Beaumont, wife of the same Robert Beaumont, who'd been at Aldridge's dinner, who had opinions about most things and shared them freely, and whose particular opinion about Abigail had been established sometime around the day the stagecoach had arrived and had not noticeably evolved since. She was in the dry goods store on the Tuesday after the Aldridge dinner when Abigail came in for a supply order, and the conversation she was having with the store owner's wife did not stop when Abigail opened the door, which meant either she didn't hear the door or she didn't care. "I don't know what Warren was thinking inviting her," Cecilia was saying. "The woman showed up half dead, and now she's inserting herself into every business arrangement in the county." Abigail took a basket from the stack near the door and went to the first shelf. "Colton Reeves is a reasonable man," Cecilia continued, "but I think he's been—" "Good morning, Mrs. Beaumont," Abigail said pleasantly from the next aisle over. A silence. Then, "Miss Carter—" "I'll be just a moment with my order," Abigail said. "Don't let me interrupt." She could hear Cecilia recalibrating from where she stood, the small sounds of someone deciding how to proceed when the subject of their conversation has turned out to be in the room. When she came around to the counter with her list, Cecilia was still there, spine very straight, with the expression of a woman who had committed to a position and wasn't going to retreat from it. "You were at the Aldridge dinner," Cecilia said. "I was," Abigail said. "Warren's very taken with you, apparently." "He was kind," Abigail said. She handed her list to the store owner's wife, who was doing her best to be invisible behind the counter. "He's not generally kind," Cecilia said. "He's generally strategic." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Abigail said. Cecilia looked at her the way people looked at her sometimes when they'd expected either apology or discomfort and gotten neither. "You do know," she said, "that whatever Warren Aldridge sees in you at a dinner table doesn't change what you are." Abigail looked at her calmly. "And what am I, Mrs. Beaumont?" A beat. "You're a mail-order bride," Cecilia said, "from back east, who arrived sick and heavy and has been positioning herself in a way that some of us find—" "The fee for this order," Abigail said to the store owner's wife, who named a number. Abigail paid it, pocketed the change, picked up the wrapped parcel. She looked at Cecilia one more time, without heat and without apology. "I'm the woman who keeps the accounts for the Reeves operation," she said. "I'm the woman who renegotiated Douglas Fitch's credit terms and saved that ranch a significant sum over the life of the agreement. I'm the woman who, in 6 weeks, will be in the room when a Chicago meatpacking consortium tries to lowball every cattle operation in this county." She paused. "What I look like has not been relevant to any of those things." She picked up her parcel and walked out. On the street, she kept walking, and she didn't let her pace change until she'd turned the corner past the livery stable. Then she stopped, leaned against the wall of the building, and let herself take 3 slow breaths. Her hands weren't shaking. She was a little surprised that they weren't. A voice said, "Mrs. Beaumont has been saying things like that since before I arrived here." She turned. Harlan was standing a few feet away, holding the lead of a horse he'd apparently just brought out of the livery. "How much did you hear?" she said. "Enough." He looped the lead around the hitching post and looked at her with the flat straightforwardness she'd come to rely on. "She said the same kind of thing about Rosa, years back, and about the Garcia family when they first got grazing rights. She's got opinions about anyone who doesn't fit whatever shape she's decided things should be." "Does it ever stop?" "The opinions?" He shrugged. "Not really. But what stops is people listening to them." He picked up the lead again. "You've been on that ranch 2 months, and Colton hasn't had a credit dispute he couldn't handle, and Aldridge is asking to borrow her to sit across from a buyer from Denver. People notice that. They stop caring about Mrs. Beaumont's opinions when they've got their own." She looked at him. "You've thought about this." "I think about most things," he said. "I'm just quiet about it." He walked the horse off down the street. She watched him go, and then she picked up her parcel and started back toward where she'd left the wagon, and the morning went on around her. The blacksmith 2 buildings down, a dog crossing the street at its own unhurried pace, the sound of the wind finding the gaps between the buildings. And she let it. The Rutherford meeting was 3 weeks out when Colton came home one afternoon with the standard contract the buyer had sent ahead, as requested. It was everything Abigail had predicted. The price structure was tied to the Chicago Exchange Index with no floor guarantee. The penalty clause for non-delivery was severe, triple the value of the undelivered stock. And there was a quality specification buried in the 3rd section that was vague enough to give the buyer considerable discretion in deciding whether any given shipment met the terms. She spread it out on the kitchen table and went through it section by section, making notes in the margin of a separate piece of paper in her small, precise handwriting. Colton sat across from her and watched her read, which he'd started doing when she worked through contracts, not hovering, just present, available if she wanted to say something aloud. "The quality specification," she said when she reached it. "Look at this language. Consistent with established grade standards as determined by the buyer's representative at point of delivery. That means he can reject a shipment and you have no recourse. Can we change that language? We can try." She kept reading. "The penalty clause is the bigger problem. Triple value within 30 days of missed delivery. Any bad weather, any disease in the herd, anything that disrupts supply. You're not just not getting paid, you're paying him. He must know no rancher will sign that. He knows that ranchers who want the contract badly enough will sign almost anything," she said, "and he's probably right for most of them. She reached the end of the document, made 2 more notes, and looked up. Here's what I think. The floor price and the quality language are the non-negotiable problems. Without fixing those, no ranch in this group should sign. The penalty clause can probably be negotiated down to a reasonable liquidated damages amount, if we're willing to accept some limit on our ability to renegotiate price in years 2 and 3. Is that a good trade? Depends on how much volume he's offering and how long the contract runs. She looked at her notes. I need to know more about the Chicago operation before I can answer that. Who they supply, what their production volume is, whether they've had disputes with ranches in Colorado or Kansas. She paused. Can Aldridge get that information? Aldridge has connections everywhere, Colton said. Then I need a week with whatever he can find, and then I'll know what position to take in the room. Colton looked at her for a moment. You're ready for this. I've been ready for this since I was 20 years old, she said. I just didn't have a room to be ready in. He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his face. Not quite pride, because that implied he'd had something to do with it, and he was too honest for that. Something closer to the particular feeling of being glad that a thing exists. Glad that she was there. Glad in the specific way that had nothing to do with the arrangement and everything to do with her. She looked back at the contract. I'll need to write to Aldridge tonight, and I'll need the territorial agricultural reports from the last 2 quarters. I'll get them from the barn office. Thank you. He got up. She kept working. The lamp cast its circle of light on the table, on the contract and the notes, and her handwriting filling the margins. Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the scrub in the yard the way it did in the evenings, low and steady. She heard Colton's boots on the boards of the front room, the sound of the barn office door, the ranch going on around her in its familiar evening way. She had been here 3 months. She had arrived sick and scared and carrying everything she owned in a carpet bag. And she had fallen to the ground before she'd even made it to the man she'd agreed to marry, and she had heard herself described as soft and heavy and destined not to last. She had not left. She was not going to leave. She wrote the letter to Warren Aldridge in her careful, even hand, and she did not use more words than the situation required, and she signed it with her full name, Abigail Carter, Reeves Cattle Ranch. And she folded it and set it ready for the morning post. And she went back to the contract and kept working until the lamp needed trimming and the night had settled fully over the mesa. She kept working. That was what she did. And there was no one left at the kitchen table to tell her she couldn't. The letter to Warren Aldridge produced results within 4 days. Not a response by post, but Aldridge himself, arriving at the ranch on a Thursday morning on a good horse with a leather satchel across his shoulder that turned out to contain everything his contacts in Colorado and Kansas had been able to find about the Rutherford buying operation and its parent consortium in Chicago. He sat at the kitchen table where Abigail had spread the Rutherford contract and its accompanying notes, and he watched her go through his materials with the same quality of attention she'd seen in men who were deciding whether a piece of land was worth buying. Focused, unhurried, not performing the work but actually doing it. Rosa brought coffee and then made herself scarce, which was her particular form of tact. There were disputes in Colorado, Aldridge said after a while. 3 ranches, 2 of them settled quietly. 1 went to a territorial arbitration panel. I saw the arbitration summary, Abigail said, not looking up from the document she was reading. The panel found in favor of the consortium on the quality specification dispute, which tells me the language they're using has already been tested in a proceeding and survived it. They didn't put that clause in by accident. Aldridge leaned back. So it can't be changed? It can be changed. They'll resist changing it because they know it's been upheld once. She set the document down and looked at him. But that arbitration only found that the language was enforceable as written. It didn't find that the buyer had used it fairly. There's a difference. She picked up another page. The ranch that lost, the Dunmore operation, north of Pueblo, they had a shipment rejected on the grounds that the cattle showed signs of what the buyer's representative called grade inconsistency. The arbitration panel accepted that determination without independently verifying it, meaning the buyer's man said the cattle weren't good enough, and the panel believed him. Yes, without requiring any documentation of the standard he was applying. She looked at Aldridge steadily. So what we need isn't to remove the quality specification clause. What we need is to add a definition, a specific, measurable one, that the buyer's representative has to apply in writing with documentation, that we have the right to contest through an agreed third party. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Do you know how to write that language? I can write a version of it. I'd want a territorial attorney to look it over before we take it into the room. I know one in Las Cruces, Aldridge said. So do I, she said. The one the bank uses. He's thorough. Aldridge picked up his coffee and drank it, and looked at the window, at the yard outside with its ordinary morning activity. Gus crossing between the barn and the equipment shed, the sound of horses in the near pasture. I've been running cattle in this territory for 20 years, he said. I've had a bookkeeper, a solicitor, a foreman who could do the accounts in a pinch. I have never had anyone sit down with a buyer's contract and take it apart the way you just did in 30 minutes. Abigail said nothing. What did Colton offer you to come here? Aldridge asked. The question was blunt, but it was genuine, not rude. A home, she said, and work. Aldridge nodded, like that confirmed something. And what do you want, beyond this ranch? She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. I want the ranch to be secure, she said. I want Colton not to be at the mercy of men like Fitch or buyers like Rutherford who count on the people across the table from them, not understanding what they're reading. She paused. And after that, I want to see what else can be built. Aldridge set his cup down. Come to the Rutherford meeting as part of the Rancher Coalition, not as a guest, as a participant. I go as part of the Reeves operation, she said. Obviously, he said, in a tone that suggested the qualifier was unnecessary. She nodded. Then, yes, get. The week before the Rutherford meeting, she wrote and rewrote the quality specification language 4 times. The Las Cruces attorney, a dry, precise man named Holcomb, who communicated entirely by mail and had apparently never met a document he couldn't improve, sent back 2 revisions of his own, and the final version was better than what either of them had started with, which was how good legal language worked when the people involved were actually trying. She also prepared a summary of the floor price argument, not a legal document, just a clear explanation of the logic, written in plain sentences that could be read aloud in a meeting room if necessary, that laid out why an index-tied price without a guaranteed floor exposed every ranch in the coalition to exactly the kind of risk that made multi-year contracts unreliable. She included 3 years of Chicago Exchange data from the agricultural reports, a drought year and 2 reasonable years, showing what the index-tied price would have produced versus a floor guarantee in the same period. The drought year was the argument. 1 bad season and the index tanked, and any ranch locked into that structure would have sold their cattle for less than it cost to raise them. Colton read the summary one evening, slowly, going back over the numbers twice. This is damning, he said. I know. Rutherford knows this too. He knows it. He's counting on the ranchers in that room not having done the same calculation. She took the summary back and looked it over. The question is whether, when they see it laid out this way, they hold together as a coalition or whether he picks them off one by one with side offers. He'll try to pick them off, Colton said. That's how these things work. He'll offer one operation slightly better terms to break the group. Yes, she'd thought about this, which is why the summary needs to go to every rancher in the coalition before the meeting. Not at the meeting, before it. So they've all seen the same numbers and they know what a side offer is worth relative to what they're giving up. Colton looked at her. You want me to distribute this? I want Aldridge to distribute it, she said. It'll carry more weight coming from him, but you should be the one to suggest it. He was quiet for a moment. You think about 3 things at once. Usually more, she said. It's sometimes inconvenient. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then he just nodded and picked up the summary and went to find paper for the letter to Aldridge. The Rutherford meeting was held in the back room of the Darrow Flats Hotel, the largest interior space in town that wasn't a church, on a Thursday morning in January when the temperature outside was cold enough to make the windows fog at the edges. 8 ranchers from the coalition were there: Colton, Aldridge, Beaumont, Garcia, and 4 others whose spreads covered the eastern and northern portions of the territory's cattle country. Abigail sat beside Colton with the annotated contract and her summary and Holcomb's revised quality specification in a folder on the table in front of her. Rutherford was younger than she'd expected, Mid-40s, with the particular brand of confidence that came from doing the same thing repeatedly and winning it repeatedly, and a very good suit that was slightly wrong for New Mexico in January. He had an associate with him, a quiet man named Peel, who took notes and said nothing. Rutherford opened with the kind of presentation that was clearly practiced: the scale of the Chicago operation, the volume on offer, the stability of a long-term supply relationship versus the volatility of the open market. It was good. He'd done it before and he knew where it landed. When he finished, there was the usual silence that follows a presentation where everyone in the room is waiting to see who speaks first. "The floor price," Abigail said. Rutherford looked at her. He'd looked at her when they'd been introduced, and his expression had moved through something she'd cataloged and set aside. Now he looked at her with more attention. "I'm sorry?" "The price structure is index-tied with no floor guarantee," she said. "I've prepared a summary of what that structure would have returned to a representative operation in this territory over the past 3 years, including the drought year of 1881. Would it be useful to walk through those numbers?" A pause. "That's not typically, in 1881, she said, the Chicago Exchange Index dropped 31% between May and October. A ranch delivering 200 head at the index-tied price in September of that year would have received approximately $14 per head. The cost of raising those animals to delivery weight in this territory, accounting for feed, water, labor, and land costs, was between $16 and $18 per head." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a bad year, that's an unsustainable year. And it would have occurred under your proposed contract structure with no recourse for any of the operations in this room." The room was quiet. She could feel the ranchers on either side of her doing something, not moving, but shifting in some internal way. The slight change that happens when numbers confirm something you'd suspected but hadn't seen laid out. Rutherford looked at his associate. Something passed between them. "Market volatility is a risk inherent to—" "Yes," she said, "it is. Which is why we're asking for a floor guarantee. Not a fixed price, a floor. Something below which the index-tied price cannot fall for the duration of the contract." She slid a copy of the summary across the table. "We've calculated a floor that we believe is workable for both sides. It protects our operations in a bad year and doesn't materially affect your costs in an average or good year." Rutherford picked up the summary. He read it. Peel leaned over and read it with him. The quality specification language came next, then the penalty clause, then a proposed revision to the delivery schedule that gave the coalition more flexibility in drought conditions. Each point had been prepared, had documentation behind it, had a version that the coalition wanted, and a position they could fall back to if necessary. Abigail moved through them with the same steadiness she brought to the ledgers. Not aggressive, not apologetic, just clear. It took 3 hours. Rutherford pushed back on the floor price and the quality specification hardest, conceded on the penalty clause faster than she'd expected, which told her the triple value structure had been a negotiating position rather than a real requirement, and tried twice to suggest that certain concerns might be addressed through modifications to individual ranch agreements rather than coalition-wide terms, which was exactly the side offer strategy she'd anticipated. Both times, the ranchers around the table declined, which meant the work of getting the summary distributed ahead of time had done what it was meant to do. At the end of the 3 hours, Rutherford looked across the table at Abigail with an expression that was professionally neutral but had something real behind it. "I'll need to take the revised terms back to Chicago," he said. "We can have a response within 3 weeks." "That's acceptable," she said. He gathered his papers. His associate gathered his notes. At the door, Rutherford paused and looked back, and he said, not to the room, to her specifically, "Where did you train?" "My father's dry goods business," she said. 12 years. He nodded once and left. The room exhaled. Aldridge said, "Well, just that. Just the one word, with everything it contained." Robert Beaumont, who had not said more than 10 words to Abigail since the Aldridge dinner, and whose wife had said considerably more than that in the dry goods store, looked at her from across the table and said, "How did you know he'd try the side offer?" "It's what I would have done," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded with the specific quality of a man revising an opinion he'd held long enough to be embarrassed about. Chicago came back in 19 days with a counteroffer. The floor price was lower than the coalition's proposal, but higher than the original structure implied. The quality specification language incorporated 60% of Holcomb's revision. The penalty clause came down to single value, 30-day notice, with a force majeure carve-out for natural disaster and disease. It was not everything she'd asked for. It was substantially better than what Rutherford had walked in with, and it was the same set of terms for every operation in the coalition, which meant nobody had been picked off. She wrote her analysis of the counteroffer in 2 pages. What was acceptable, what remained problematic, what she recommended, and sent it to Aldridge. His response came back the next day. Coalition agrees. Proceed. The contracts were signed in February in the same hotel back room without fanfare. Rutherford shook hands with each of the ranchers. When he reached Abigail, he said, "If you're ever in Chicago," and then seemed to realize the sentence didn't have a useful ending and settled for a nod. She shook his hand. "Safe travels," she said. Ciao. What came after was not a single transformation, but a series of smaller ones, which was how things actually changed when they changed for real. The ranch accounts, already in order, became the basis for a set of projections. 3-year estimates, drought scenarios, best case and realistic case outcomes that gave Colton something he'd never had before. A clear picture of where the operation stood, not just now, but potentially, given various conditions. He used them. He made decisions based on them, which was different from the way his father had run things, different from the way most operations in the territory ran. He'd absorb the projections on a Sunday evening and then go quiet, the productive quiet, and by Monday morning he'd have something to say about the next season's decisions. It was, she thought, the thing she'd been made for. Not the numbers themselves, but what the numbers allowed. The forward visibility. The ability to see the trouble coming early enough to move around it. The drought came in the summer of the 2nd year. Not a catastrophe, more of a hard season, the kind the territory saw every 5 or 6 years, where the creek dropped to nothing by June and the grass in the lower pastures went brown by July. 2 operations south of Darrow Flats lost significant portions of their herds because they'd been running at capacity and had no room to move animals to other grazing. The Reeves Ranch had shifted a third of its herd to the East Mesa pastures in April, 3 weeks before the creek dropped, because Abigail had been watching the winter snowpack numbers from the territorial weather station reports and had noticed the deficit. Harlan had moved the cattle without question, which she noted. Pete had helped without being asked, which she also noted. Gus had spent a week reinforcing the East Mesa water catchment structures, working steadily and without ceremony, and when she'd thanked him, he'd said it needed doing in the flat way he said most things, which was his version of warmth. The Beaumont operation lost 40 head that summer and came close to losing more. Robert Beaumont came to the ranch in August, not to ask for help, not exactly, but to ask if the East Mesa catchment had capacity that might be shared, for a fee, for the remainder of the dry period. Abigail and Colton discussed it that evening. The fee Beaumont proposed was fair. They said yes. It was the first time Robert Beaumont had done business with the Reeves Ranch directly, and he handled it without the awkwardness she might have expected. He was a practical man when it came down to the practical, whatever his wife's opinions were. She did not mention the dry goods store conversation to either of them. It would not have served anything. The market crash came the following spring, not local but national. A collapse in beef prices driven by overproduction in Texas and a railroad rate dispute that disrupted eastern delivery, which sent prices down sharply enough that ranches carrying debt felt it immediately. The Reeves operation felt it too. The Chicago contract provided some insulation, that floor price doing exactly what it had been designed to do. But there were other revenue streams that suffered, and the cash position in March was tight enough that Abigail went through the expense ledgers twice, looking for places to trim without cutting into the operation's capacity. She found 3. A supply contract with an Albuquerque vendor that had quietly repriced upward over 2 years without triggering any formal renegotiation. She wrote to the vendor and renegotiated it in a single letter. A maintenance expense that had been recurring quarterly on equipment that had already been replaced. A bookkeeping error from before her time, still being paid by habit. A hay purchase arrangement that made sense in a normal year and didn't in a drought recovery year, which she restructured as a seasonal contract rather than a standing one. None of them were large. Together they were enough. She told Colton at supper, He put his fork down and looked at her in the way he had when she'd shown him the $83 discrepancy in the first weeks, which now felt like a long time ago. The hay contract especially, she said. We were paying for standing availability we don't need from March through May. If we shift to seasonal, we save about... Abigail, he said. She stopped. I want to ask you something, he said. She set her fork down too. He reached into his shirt pocket and put something on the table between them. It was a ring. Plain gold, narrow, nothing elaborate. The kind of ring that had been made with permanence in mind rather than impression. I've been carrying this since December, he said. I kept waiting for the right moment, and then I kept deciding the moment was wrong because something needed doing first. And I've realized that something is always going to need doing first. So I'm just going to ask. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. He was not comfortable with this. She could see it in the set of his jaw. The particular tension he got when he'd committed to something that required him to be exposed. He was doing it anyway. Abigail Carter, he said, I'd like you to be my wife. Not because of any bureau or any arrangement, because this ranch is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and I... He stopped. I love you. I'm not good at saying it, but I do. The kitchen was warm from the stove. Outside, the spring wind was doing something gentle to the yard, which was unusual. Usually it came in hard, and the sound of it was almost quiet. She picked up the ring. You've been carrying this since December, she said. Yes, that's 4 months. I know. Colton. She looked at him. You could have just asked. I was working up to it. 4 months is a long time to work up to something. I'm aware of that, he said, with the beginning of something rueful. She put the ring on. It was slightly loose, but close enough. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. The rueful look became something else. She'd learned his face well enough by now to know what relief looked like on it, and what was underneath the relief. And it was the thing she'd seen building for months. The particular feeling of someone who has been carrying a hope carefully for a long time, and has finally been allowed to set it down. We'll need to go into town to see the justice of the peace, he said. Next week is fine, she said. After the supply order. He looked at her. After the supply order. There's no urgency, she said. You said that once. He laughed. A real one, the kind that caught him by surprise. She'd learned that one too, the way his whole face changed when something actually reached him. She picked up her fork. He picked up his. They finished supper. The wedding happened on a Tuesday, because Tuesday was when the supply order was done and the justice of the peace was available, and neither of them saw a reason to wait for a more ceremonially appropriate day of the week. Rosa came, and Harlan came, and Pete came, in his good shirt looking slightly strangled by the collar. Warren Aldridge sent a note, which arrived the morning of, saying congratulations and about time, which she suspected was a sentiment Aldridge had been sitting on for a while. Cecilia Beaumont was not there, but her husband Robert was, standing in the back of the justice's office with his hat in his hands. And when it was done, he shook Colton's hand and said, "Best thing you ever did," with the conviction of a man who'd arrived at that opinion through evidence rather than politeness. It was not a beautiful ceremony. The justice of the peace read the relevant legal language at a speed that suggested he had somewhere else to be, and Pete knocked over a chair getting settled, and Rosa cried silently and comprehensively from start to finish. Colton got through his portion without stumbling, which she could see cost him something, and she got through hers steadily, which cost her less only because she'd had more practice controlling what showed on her face. When it was done, in the dusty little office on the main street of Darrow Flats, she was Abigail Reeves. She turned the ring on her finger, they'd had it sized at the jeweler's that morning, and looked at the man beside her who was now her husband. And he looked back with that face she'd learned, and whatever she felt in that moment was not simple enough for a single word. It was several things layered over each other: relief and determination, and something that was absolutely love, and something that was also just the ordinary, unglamorous reality of two imperfect people who had managed, against reasonable odds, to find each other useful and dear. "Supper," he said. "We should get back," she said. "Harlan said the east fence section needs attention, and I want to look at the numbers before the week's out." Abigail. "What?" "We just got married," he said. "I know," she said. "We can look at the fence numbers tomorrow. Supper today." He held out his arm. She took it. They walked out into the January afternoon, into the particular cold clarity of a New Mexico winter day, and the town went on around them in its ordinary way, and neither of them said anything for a moment, just walked, the way two people walk when they've run out of reasons to pretend they're not where they are. The ranch was 6 miles out. They had the wagon and the afternoon and the long flat road, and the mesa in the distance going orange at the edges with the lowering sun, and nothing that needed to be said that hadn't already been said or would not keep until the kind of evening where the stove was lit and the lamp was burning and the ledgers could wait for once. She looked at the road ahead. He looked at it too. It was not a perfect life. It would not become a perfect life. There would be bad seasons and difficult years and mornings where the work was too much, and evenings where they didn't agree, and the ordinary accumulated weight of building something in a place that pushed back constantly. There would be things she couldn't fix with a ledger, and things he couldn't fix with a fence post, and the particular friction of two people who were both, in their different ways, stubborn. But it was real. It was hers. And she had learned in the years since she'd stepped off a stagecoach in a frontier town and fallen into a stranger's arms, that real and hers were worth more than she'd ever been told to expect. The wagon wheels turned on the red dirt road. The mesa held its shape against the sky. The ranch waited ahead of them in the late afternoon light, and they drove toward it together. And the day went on. The first years of a marriage are supposed to be the easy ones. That was what people said. The early years, before the weight of time settled in, before the small irritations calcified into permanent grievances, before the work of being together became indistinguishable from the work of everything else. People said it with a particular nostalgic softness, as though they were describing weather. Abigail and Colton's first years were not easy. They were good, which is a different thing entirely. The spring after the wedding brought a fence dispute with a neighboring operation to the north. A man named Cord Tillman, who ran sheep on land that abutted the Reeves East Mesa pasture and who had been quietly extending his grazing boundary for 2 seasons, a few yards at a time, in the way that only becomes visible when you're measuring against old survey markers. Harlan noticed it first, came to Abigail with the observation the way he'd started bringing her things that needed thinking about rather than just doing. She walked the boundary herself, on a cold April morning with the survey record she'd pulled from the county clerk's filing last fall tucked under her arm, and she paced out the discrepancy. It was 60 yards of encroachment across a 300-yard frontage. Not enormous. Not nothing. Colton's first instinct was to ride over and have a conversation with Tillman that would involve raised voices and probably not accomplish much. She asked him to wait. He waited, which cost him something, but he waited. She wrote to the county land office instead, requesting a formal boundary confirmation survey at the Reeves' expense. The response came in 6 weeks. A surveyor, a set of new markers, and a legal document confirming the Reeves boundary as originally recorded. She sent a copy to Tillman with a polite note explaining the survey results and requesting that the sheep grazing be returned to the correct side of the line within 30 days. Tillman came to the ranch the following week, not to argue, but to apologize, which surprised Colton and didn't particularly surprise Abigail. Men who pushed boundaries quietly, she'd found, generally did so because no one had pushed back with paperwork before. Paper had a way of clarifying things that confrontation didn't. "You didn't want me to go talk to him," Colton said afterward. "I wanted you to wait until we had something solid to stand on," she said. "The difference between going over there angry and going over there with a county surveyor's confirmation is the difference between a dispute and a resolved dispute." He considered that. What if he hadn't responded to the letter? "Then you'd have gone over there," she said, "with the survey document in hand, which is different from going over there without it." He was quiet for a moment. "You think about things differently than I do." "Yes," she said. "That's why this works." It wasn't arrogance. It was just the plain truth of it, stated without apology. He'd learned to hear it that way. Their first child was born in the 3rd year of the marriage, in October, during a week when the cattle were being moved to winter pasture and the equipment shed roof had developed a leak and the Chicago contract was up for renewal. The timing was, as Rosa observed with the dry humor she deployed on most things, entirely characteristic. The baby was a girl. They named her Clara, which had been Colton's mother's name, and which Abigail had agreed to without hesitation because she understood the weight of continuity and didn't have the kind of vanity that needed to make everything new. Clara arrived at 4 in the morning on a Wednesday, attended by Rosa and the doctor from Darrow Flats, who made the 6-mile drive out in the dark without complaint because he'd been making that drive for various emergencies since before Abigail had arrived, and who was accustomed to the Reeves Ranch generating more than its share of situations that needed handling. Colton sat outside the bedroom door for the entire duration, which was 7 hours, which Rosa told him was not necessary and which he declined to stop doing. When the doctor opened the door and said the word fine, both of them, mother and child, fine, something in Colton's face came apart quietly in the way things did with him when something real reached him past the composed surface he wore. Abigail, exhausted and disheveled and not entirely herself yet, heard him come in and looked at him from the bed with Clara in her arms, and she said, "She has your forehead." He looked at his daughter. "Is that a problem?" "The forehead's fine," she said. "It's the stubbornness I'm worried about." He sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair, though she didn't know if he'd thought of it this way, where he'd spent the first 2 nights of her fever 4 years ago. He looked at Clara for a long time without saying anything, and she let him look. "She's very small," he said finally. "They start that way," Abigail said. "I understand they get larger." He reached out and put one finger against Clara's closed fist, and the fist opened and closed around it in the way that newborns did, not intentionally, but with a grip that was surprisingly definite. He looked at that grip with an expression she had no name for and didn't try to name. Outside, the sun was coming up over the mesa. The ranch was starting its day in its ordinary way. She could hear Harlan in the yard, the sound of horses. The world was doing what it always did, indifferent to what had just changed in this room, and that indifference was not hostile, but simply true. And she had made her peace with it. 2 more children came in the years that followed. A boy, James, in the 5th year, who arrived less dramatically than Clara and made up for it by being consistently louder from the beginning. And another girl, Nell, in the 7th year, who was quiet and watchful from infancy in a way that reminded Abigail so specifically of herself at that age that it occasionally startled her. The house grew with them, not by dramatic renovation but incrementally. A room added when James arrived, another addition when Nell came. The covered porch extended because the children needed somewhere to be in the evenings when the weather allowed. Rosa's domain in the kitchen remained inviolably hers, which everyone understood implicitly, but a second table appeared at the kitchen's edge because the original one had stopped fitting everyone. The ranch grew too, though not recklessly. The Chicago contract renewed on better terms than the original. Abigail negotiated the second renewal herself, with Colton in the room and Aldridge's support, and Rutherford's replacement, a younger man named Carver, who'd apparently been told what to expect, came in with a more reasonable opening position than his predecessor had. The coalition held. 4 of the original 8 operations were still in it. The others had sold or consolidated or decided the arrangement wasn't for them, and 2 newer ranches had joined. The land expanded too. Not Tillman's fence line, but parcels that came available over the years. Adjacent pieces that made the operation more coherent, bought carefully and with attention to what the acquisition cost, meant relative to the carrying capacity and what the drought scenarios looked like across the whole enlarged holding. Each decision went through the same process. The projections, the scenarios, the conversation at the kitchen table that sometimes lasted 1 evening and sometimes lasted 3, where Colton would look at the numbers and ask questions, and she would answer them and sometimes change her recommendation based on what he saw that she'd missed, which happened more often than she'd have predicted in the early years, and which she'd come to regard as one of the more useful aspects of building something with someone whose mind worked differently than hers. He saw the land. She saw the books. Between them, they saw the whole thing. Harlan retired in the 8th year, when his knees had given him enough trouble that the daily work of the ranch had become something he was fighting through rather than doing. The retirement was not dramatic. He told Colton on a Monday morning that he figured he'd done enough of this particular kind of work, and Colton told him there was a place at the ranch for him that didn't involve getting on and off horses 17 times a day, and Harlan said he'd think about it and then stayed, which was what everyone had expected. He took over the equipment records and the supply receiving, work that could be done from a standing position and didn't require the constant mobility the outdoor work did. He was good at it in the way he'd always been good at things: thorough, unhurried, with the particular talent for noticing discrepancies that came from decades of paying attention to what things were supposed to look like. Pete had become a senior hand by then, with two younger men working under him. He'd grown into his position the way some people did, not quickly or dramatically, but through accumulated reliability, through being the person who showed up and did the thing, and did it right, and didn't need to be asked twice. He'd long since stopped looking sideways at Abigail with that residue of guilt. What he had instead was a straightforward respect that expressed itself in the practical currency of the ranch. He brought her the information she needed before she asked for it. He backed her positions in the field when decisions needed to be made. He made sure the new hands understood that the woman in the ranch house with the account books was not a peripheral figure. She'd never told him to do any of those things. He'd arrived at them himself. Gus was still there too, quieter than ever, working with the consistency of something geological. She'd once asked him, in a rare conversation that went longer than the transactional minimum, what he liked about ranch work. He'd thought about it for a while and said, "It's clear what needs doing." She'd understood that exactly. The situation with Cecilia Beaumont resolved itself, as certain things did, through the particular mechanism of shared difficulty. It was in the 9th year, when Robert Beaumont had a stroke in March that left him with partial use of his left side and a recovery that the doctor in Darrow Flats said would be long and uncertain. The Beaumont operation was not small, but it was also not organized in a way that prepared for the principal operator to be suddenly absent. Robert's oldest son was 17 and capable, but not experienced, and there were decisions coming in the spring. The branding season, the cattle movement, a note at the territorial bank that was due in May, that required someone who understood ranch finance. Cecilia Beaumont came to the Reeves Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon. She came without sending word ahead, which suggested she'd been working up to it for several days, and had decided that if she gave herself time to think about it, she wouldn't come. Rosa showed her into the front room, where Abigail was working at the desk. Abigail looked up and registered the visit and what it had cost the woman to make it, and she put down her pen and said, "Sit down, Mrs. Beaumont." Cecilia sat. She was a woman who had always used her posture as armor, and she had it deployed now. But there were other things in her face that the armor didn't entirely cover: exhaustion and fear, and something that was in the neighborhood of humility, though it hadn't quite arrived there yet. "Robert's not improving as fast as the doctor thought," she said. "I'm sorry," Abigail said. She meant it, which was a choice she'd made somewhere in the years between the dry goods store conversation and this afternoon. "The banknote is due in May," Cecilia said. I've never managed the accounts." She stopped. "I need help." Abigail looked at her for a moment, not to make her wait, just because the moment deserved to be acknowledged for what it was. "All right," she said. "Let's start with the note. Do you have the documentation with you?" Cecilia reached into her bag and produced a folder of papers that were not organized but were complete. Abigail took them and began to read. And within 20 minutes she had a picture of the Beaumont operation's financial position that was clearer than Cecilia probably had herself, and she began to explain what she was seeing. Cecilia listened. She asked questions. Some of the questions were good ones. By the end of 2 hours, she understood the banknote situation well enough to manage the conversation with the bank officer herself, which was what Abigail had been aiming for rather than managing it on her behalf. "The account structure," Cecilia said at the end. "The way you've separated the categories. Robert's bookkeeper it's all in one ledger with no—" "I know," Abigail said. "I can show you a system if you want. It would take a few sessions." A pause. "I would want that," Cecilia said. She looked at her hands. "I owe you an apology." "You don't need to "I do," Cecilia said, with the particular firmness of someone who has made up their mind to do something uncomfortable and is not going to be talked out of the discomfort. "What I said in the dry goods store. I was unkind and I was wrong, and I've known for years that I was wrong, and I've been too proud to say so." She looked up. "I'm saying so now." Abigail looked at her. There were things she could have said, the various forms of "it's all right" that people offered when they didn't want to have the real conversation, or the gracious dismissal that would have ended it quickly. She didn't say any of them. "What made you decide I was wrong?" she asked instead. "Not unkindly," just genuinely. Cecilia was quiet for a moment. Robert came home from the hotel meeting, the one with the buyer, with Rutherford. He said you were the only person in that room who actually understood what was in the contract. He said the ranchers would have signed something that would have cost them all significantly if you hadn't gone through it. She paused. He said he'd misjudged you and that his wife had too, and I told him he was being generous, and he said... She stopped. What did he say? He said that what I was doing had more to do with how you looked than with anything you'd actually done, and that it was not my finest quality. She looked at the window. He was right. Abigail let that sit for a moment. Thank you for telling me, she said, finally. I should have told you sooner, Cecilia said, but I wasn't ready to be honest about it sooner. That, Abigail thought, was the most honest thing the woman had ever said in her presence. It was more than most people managed. Come on Thursday, she said. We'll go through the account system. Bring the last 2 years of ledgers, if you can find them. Cecilia came on Thursday. She came the Thursday after that. By the third session, she was asking questions that showed she'd been working through the material between visits, and by the fifth, she'd renegotiated the banknote herself and reported back to Abigail with the particulars. And there was in her voice something that Abigail recognized, the specific quality of satisfaction that came from doing something you'd been told implicitly by the shape of your life that you couldn't do. She didn't say anything about recognizing it, but she thought about it for a long time after Cecilia had gone. Warren Aldridge died in the 11th year from a heart that had been reliable for 6 decades and then wasn't. Eleanor held the service at the ranch house, which was what he'd wanted, and there were more people there than the rooms could comfortably hold, which would have pleased him. Abigail sat with Eleanor in the aftermath, in the large kitchen of the Aldridge house, when the guests had gone and the quiet had settled back in. He thought very highly of you, Eleanor said, not the way people said ceremonial things at these moments, with the flatness of something true. He was fair to me before he had a reason to be, Abigail said. That counted for something. Eleanor turned her coffee cup in her hands. She was a composed woman, had been composed all day in the way that took enormous effort and left a particular kind of exhaustion afterward. He said once, after the Rutherford meeting, that you were the best business mind he'd encountered in 30 years of cattle operations. She looked at Abigail. He didn't say that about people easily. Abigail looked at the table. He taught me things too. The way he'd built the coalition, the way he understood that any operation was only as strong as the relationships around it. I learned from watching him. He didn't think of himself as a teacher. The best ones usually don't. Eleanor was quiet for a while. Outside, the November wind was moving across the Aldridge land in long, slow waves through the dry grass. The same wind that moved across the Reeves land 6 miles south. The same mesa holding the same shape against the same sky. I don't know how to run this operation, Eleanor said. Yes, you do, Abigail said. You've been watching it for 30 years. Watching isn't the same as doing. No, but it's where you start. She looked at Eleanor steadily. You know who the reliable hands are. You know which vendors your husband trusted. You know the shape of the land. She paused. The account system is the part I can help you with. The rest you already carry. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. He was right about you, she said. He was right about most things, Abigail said, though he'd have been insufferable if you'd told him that directly. The sound Eleanor made was somewhere between a laugh and something more complicated, which was right for that particular moment. Clara was 15 when she started sitting in on the account work. Not because she'd been asked, but because she came into the kitchen one evening where Abigail was working through the quarterly projections and sat down at the other end of the table and watched without speaking. Abigail let her watch. After 20 minutes, Clara said, "What's that column?" And Abigail explained it, and the explanation led to another question, and by the end of the evening, Clara had the general structure of the projection system in her head and was asking why the drought scenario used a 30% reduction factor rather than 25%. Because the worst drought in territorial records was 32%, Abigail said. 25 is probably sufficient, but 30 gives us more room. Does more room cost something? Clara asked. Good question, Abigail said. She showed her. Colton, who had come in from the evening rounds and was at the stove with coffee, listened to this exchange and said nothing. But later, when Clara had gone to bed and they were alone in the kitchen, he said, "She's got your mind." "She's got her own mind," Abigail said. "It happens to work in a similar direction." "Same thing." "No, it isn't," she said. "Don't make her mine. She's hers." He looked at her over his coffee. Fair point. James was a different matter, what? Not less capable, but differently organized, with the spatial intelligence that made him natural with the land and the animals in the way Colton had always been, and less patience for the ledger work than his sister had. He'd come to her sometimes with practical problems that had a numerical component, the yield calculation for a new pasture, the feed cost comparison for two different supplements, and she'd show him what he needed and he'd take it and apply it and not particularly want to understand the broader system around it. She respected that. Not everyone needed to see the whole picture to do their part of it well. Nell was 12 when the story of Abigail's arrival in Darrow Flats first reached her in a form complete enough to understand, told not by her parents but by Pete's wife, a woman named Louisa who'd grown up in the territory and had heard the story in the particular way it had been retold over the years, which was different from how it had happened but carried the essential truth of it. Nell came home and found her mother at the kitchen desk and said, "Pete's wife said you fell off the stagecoach when you arrived." Abigail put her pen down. "I didn't fall off the stagecoach. I stepped off and then my knees gave. I'd been sick for 2 days on the road." "But you fell." "I was caught." Nell considered this. "Were you scared?" Abigail thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to think about her own history, not softening it into something instructive, not hardening it into a lesson, just looking at it as it was. "I was scared before," she said, "on the coach, in the days before I arrived. I didn't know what I was coming to." "Were you scared when you fell?" "I didn't have time to be scared when I fell," she said. "It happened too fast." Nell was quiet for a moment. "What were you scared of before?" "That it wouldn't work," Abigail said. "That I'd come all this way and it would be wrong, or I'd be wrong for it." "Were you?" Abigail looked at her youngest daughter, at the watchful eyes, the careful stillness that reminded her so much of her own younger self, the self that had sat in a park in Philadelphia and read an advertisement 4 times and been afraid. "No," she said. "I wasn't wrong for it." "How did you know?" Nell asked. Abigail picked up her pen. "I didn't. Not for a while." She looked at the ledger open on the desk, at the numbers that represented 1,000 decisions made over 11 years, the shape of something built from nothing except the willingness to keep working. "You don't always know ahead of time. Sometimes you just go and find out." Nell looked at the ledger too, and then back at her mother, with that particular expression she had of storing something away. "Okay," she said, and went to help Rosa with supper. The hardest year was the 13th, not for any single reason. The ranch was in the best shape it had ever been. The Chicago contract was solid, the land was paid and productive, the children were well. But Colton's back, which had been a periodic problem for years, became a constant one, and by March he was in enough pain on bad days that the full scope of the outdoor work had become something he was managing rather than doing freely. He didn't complain. That was the problem. He absorbed it into himself in the way he'd always absorbed difficulties, and she found out the extent of it not from him but from Harlan, who mentioned it with the same matter-of-fact delivery he used for supply discrepancies. She didn't confront him. She'd learned something about the specific pride of men who were accustomed to physical competence and were watching it become unreliable. There was no approach to that conversation that didn't go wrong if it came from the direction of concern. What she did instead was rearrange the work. She put James in charge of the cattle movement operations. He was 19 and more than capable, and it gave him a formal authority over the outdoor work that he'd been growing into informally for 2 years. She formalized Harlan's role in equipment and supply management, which gave it the weight of the ranch's structure rather than an informal accommodation. She restructured the weekly planning meeting, something she'd established years ago, so that it started with the land and livestock questions, which meant Colton's input was built into the decisions at the beginning, when his knowledge mattered most, rather than requiring him to be physically everywhere all the time. None of it was announced as a solution to anything. It was just how things were organized now. Colton knew. He wasn't a man who missed things happening around him, and he was especially not a man who missed things when those things were being done by the person he knew better than anyone. One evening in April, when the new arrangement had been running for about 6 weeks, he came in from what had been a shorter day than he'd once have had and sat at the kitchen table and looked at her. "You did this for me," he said. "I reorganized the operational structure," she said. "Abigail." She looked up from the ledger. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze. In 13 years, she'd learned his face as thoroughly as she'd ever learned anything, and what was in it now was not the stoic composure he offered the world, but the unarmored version underneath. A man who was getting older in a body that was reminding him of it, who had built something real and was afraid of becoming a weight on it, and who had just had the evidence laid out plainly that the operation didn't depend on his physical presence alone. "The operation runs well because you built it well," she said, "long before I got here. What I've done is with what you made." "That's not entirely true," he said. "It's mostly true," she said. "The rest is just accounting." He made the almost laugh sound. "Just accounting. The accounting matters," she said. "I know it does." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers where it rested on the open ledger, and she turned her hand palm up and held his, and they stayed like that for a while in the kitchen that was theirs, completely, incontestably, permanently theirs, with the lamp burning and the sounds of the ranch's evening settling around them. Awesome. 15 years after Abigail Carter stepped off a stagecoach in Darrow Flats and fell into a stranger's arms, the Reeves Cattle Ranch was among the 4 most productive operations in the territory. Not the largest. Productive, which was a different measure, and the one she'd always cared about. It employed 11 permanent hands, supplied cattle under contract to 2 different buyers, and had a financial reserve that meant a bad year was survivable and a very bad year was manageable. More than that, though the accounts didn't capture it, and she'd long since accepted that the most important things resisted ledger entries. The ranch had become something in the community around it that she hadn't planned and couldn't have planned. The Thursday accounting sessions that had started with Cecilia Beaumont had become a standing thing. 4 or 5 women from operations around the territory who came monthly, or sent questions by mail, or brought problems that had numbers attached to them and needed someone to think through them plainly. She didn't charge for it. She thought about charging for it and then decided against it because what she was building was not a business, but a way that information moved in a community that had not had enough of it. Cecilia had become, over the years, something that Abigail would not have called a friend in the uncomplicated sense, but something that deserved a word of its own. A woman she had come through difficulty with, alongside and sometimes in opposition to, and who had learned things and changed in ways that were real, as Abigail herself had changed. Robert had recovered substantially, though not completely. He still walked with a cane and tired earlier than he used to. He and Colton had developed, in the way of men who did not seek out emotional conversation, a working relationship that involved a great deal of standing side by side, looking at land and cattle and saying practical things, and which was its own kind of friendship. The Garcia family's grazing operation had expanded, partly on advice from Abigail about a water rights filing that would have otherwise gone to a competing claim. Luis Garcia was on the coalition's steering committee. His daughter was in the Thursday accounting sessions. Douglas Fitch had sold his lending operation 2 years ago to a man who charged market rates. On a September evening in the 15th year, Abigail sat on the extended covered porch of the ranch house with the day's ledger work finished and the mesa going gold in the late light and the sounds of the ranch at its end-of-day pace around her. Clara was inside helping Rosa with supper and arguing with James about something that wasn't serious enough to worry about. Nell was on the far side of the yard, sitting on the top fence rail with a notebook, writing something that she hadn't shown anyone and wouldn't until she was ready. Colton came and sat beside her. They didn't always talk at this hour. Sometimes they just sat. She looked at the mesa. She looked at the yard, at the familiar shape of the buildings she'd watched grow over 15 years, at the fence line that had been extended and reinforced and disputed and settled, at the east pasture gate that Pete's youngest hand had just repaired that morning, at the water catchment structure on the far rise that Gus had built and maintained for a decade and that had saved the herd in the drought years. She thought about the park bench in Philadelphia and the folded newspaper. She thought about 11 days on a train and 2 days on a coach, and the specific quality of the fear she'd carried through all of it. Not the dramatic fear of a person in a story, but the quiet, practical fear of someone who had run out of options and was gambling on the only one that remained. She had not been soft. She had not been wrong for this place. She had not failed to last until spring. What she had learned, slowly and without anyone announcing it as a lesson, was this: that worth was not a fixed quantity that you either had or didn't. It was something that expressed itself through what you did with the conditions you were given. And the conditions she'd been given, the fever, the whispers, the dry goods store, the Fitch agreement, the Rutherford contract, the drought years and the hard years and the year of Colton's back, and the accumulation of every small thing that had needed doing, those conditions had not diminished her. They had simply been the material she'd worked with. She had never fit the shape that other people had decided she should fit. She had always known she didn't fit it. What she had not known, until this life had taught her, over 15 years of mornings and evenings and arguments and ledgers and children and difficult winters, was that the shape didn't matter. The shape was never the point. What you built was the point. Who you built it with was the point. The people who stayed, but the Harlans and Petes and Gooses and Rosas, the Eleanor Aldridges and the changed Cecilia Beaumonts and the Luis Garcias, those were the point. And the children who watched and learned and would carry some of it forward into lives she couldn't yet see. None of it was a perfect story. She had made mistakes in the accounts that cost money. She had been wrong about a person and trusted someone she shouldn't have once, and the consequence of that had been a supply contract that went bad, and a quarter year of financial tightness that had been unpleasant. She and Colton had fought, the way people who were honest with each other and tired sometimes fought. And the fights had been real, and some of them had left marks that took time to heal. She was still, at 41, the kind of person who took up more space than some people thought was appropriate, and there were still eyes that moved over her with that particular quality she'd cataloged since childhood, and she had not stopped noticing it, had just stopped giving it room in the part of herself that mattered. She was Abigail Reeves. She had come to this place in the back of a stagecoach with $43 and everything she owned in a bag and a fever she'd been too determined to admit to. And she had built something here that was real and lasting and hers in every way a thing could be hers. Not because anyone had given it to her, not because the world had finally decided to be fair, because she had worked and thought and stayed and paid attention and been willing to be changed by what she learned without being unmade by it. That was the whole of it. That was all it had ever been. "Cold's coming in off the mesa," Colton said. "I know," she said. "Let's stay out a little longer." He didn't argue. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stayed, the two of them, while the last light left the mesa and the stars began, and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds around them. The sounds of a place fully alive, fully inhabited, fully theirs. The wind came in off the high ground the way it always did, and the ranch received it the way it always had, and the night held them both without asking anything they hadn't already given. It was enough. It had always been enough. She had just needed long enough to learn that.